The history and evolution of technology in World War II. The Services Enigma machine. Enigma machines were used during, but also before the war, by various military groups. They were greatly advanced during the war, as security was of utmost importance. Wehrmacht Enigma 1 was the series that was used the most by Nazi Germany. The Enigma machines used a series of mechanical rotor wheels, almost like a combination lock, that would scramble the messages, and you could only unscramble the message if you had a similar machine set to the same key. The Polish had figured out the Enigma machine's mechanics because they suspected that the Germans were using a variation of a commercial Enigma encryption device, which they could largely guess the wiring from. The Polish created their own machines to decode them, but by 1938, the Germans added extra rotors, and combined with the daily cipher changes introduced at the beginning of the war, it made it too difficult to brute force using the current Polish machinery. The British bomb. Alan Turing, along with fellow codebreakers, invented a machine called the bomb, which identified possible combinations of rotors in Enigma machines to reduce the ones that needed to be manually found, and allowed them to discover rotor settings and read German Air Force signals from the mid-1940s. Jet aircraft. German physicist Hans von Ohain was the inventor of the first modern jet engine. His designs were later refined by German designer Anselm Franz for use in a jet fighter, the Me-262, while a British Royal Air Force or RAF officer independently was inventing his own jet engine, leading to the deployment of the Gloucester Meteors in England on the 27th of July 1944. These aircrafts were the only jet fighters to fly in combat during World War II, but the Me-262 spent much time not in use due to high fuel consumption at low altitudes, while the Gloucester Meteor were later only used in combat over Allied countries due to fears of being shot down by V-2 rockets. The advantages of jet engines were their increased speed over previously used piston-driven aircraft, such as the British Supermarine Spitfires. When turbojets were introduced, the top speed of fighter aircraft equipped with them was at least 150 km per hour faster than competing piston-driven aircraft. This would give both sides advantages in both recon missions and the although limited combat jet aircrafts were involved in. Modern tanks. Tanks started appearing during World War I, but were slow, unreliable, and had much to be improved upon. The tank's predecessor, the armoured car, required smooth terrain to move upon, whereas tanks could cross almost any terrain. Christie suspension, as opposed to leaf springs, was the first step to faster tanks, as it allowed further travel in the suspension by reorientating it laterally. Turrets also became essential along with pre-existing hull-mounted guns for long-range armoured targets, as well as unarmoured ones. In addition to infantry support, tanks carried out cavalry roles such as personnel and equipment transport, provided mobile artillery support, and were adapted to combat engineering roles. Although German tanks were in most cases inferior to the tanks of the Allies, the majority of German tanks had radios which gave them a tactical advantage. Penicillin. In the late 19th century, there had been many accounts by scientists and physicians on the antibacterial properties of the different types of molds, including the mold penicillium, but they were unable to discern what process was causing the effect. The effects of penicillium mold were isolated in 1928 by Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming. He had a petri dish containing the bacteria Staphylococcus that had been contaminated by a mold which formed a visible growth. There was inhibited bacterial growth around the mold. Although Alexander Fleming conducted many tests, he did not test on infected animals, which may have stunted the development of penicillin. In 1930, Cecil George Payne, a pathologist at the Royal Infirmary in Sheffield, used penicillin to cure an infection in infants. He achieved the first recorded cure with penicillin on November 25, 1930. By late 1940, the Oxford team under Howard Florey had devised a method of mass-producing the drug, but yields remained low. In 1941, Florey traveled to the US in order to interest pharmaceutical companies in producing the drug and inform them about their process. Florey gained the 1945 Nobel Prize in Medicine with Fleming for his work. Once introduced to the war, death by infection fell rapidly. In World War I, the death rate from bacterial pneumonia was 18%. In World War II, it fell to less than 1% due to the use of penicillin. Aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers range from heavily armored warships to support craft such as fuel ships and troop landing boats. They were used as relatively comfortable living spaces for soldiers at war, and as mobile bases to launch and refuel planes, since most World War II aircraft had a range of just a few hundred miles. The effectiveness of large aircraft carriers was demonstrated in the war when dozens of Japanese fighters and bombers launched from aircraft carriers decimated the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in late 1941. In May of 1942, aircraft from Japanese and U.S. carriers battled at the Coral Sea, the first naval conflict where the opposing ships did not make contact. There were also a few submarine aircraft carriers, mostly owned by the Japanese. These would allow aircraft to be launched quietly, but submarine aircraft carriers could not match the capacity of other forms of naval aircraft transport. Aircraft launched from carriers could drop torpedoes as well as bombs to eliminate both sea and ground targets, or could be mounted with guns to defend the carrier. V-weapons, known in original German as Vergeltungswaffen, retaliatory weapons, were a set of long-range artillery used during World War II for strategic bombing where the goal is to physically, economically, and socially cripple a target. They comprised of the V-1 flying bomb, in development since the mid-1930s, but saw its first flight in the 10th of December 1942, the V-2 rocket, 1944, and the V-3 cannon, 1944. The V-1 was a pulse-jet-powered cruise missile designed for the strategic bombing of London. At their peak, over 100 V-1s were fired a day in England. After the invasion of Europe by the Allies, these weapons were also employed against targets on the mainland of Europe, mainly France and Belgium. The V-Terror bombing killed approximately 18,000 people, many civilians. The V-2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It was used to attack Allied cities as retaliation for their bombings against German cities. Beginning in September 1944, over 3,000 V-2s were launched at Allied targets, first London and later Antwerp and Liège. These attacks killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and military personnel, and a further 12,000 labourers and concentration camp prisoners as a result of their forced participation in the production of these weapons. And the V-3 cannon, which was never used due to its destruction by Allied bombing raids, but worked by having many sequential charges to accelerate a projectile to high speed. The atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was the invention that finally brought the end of World War II. April of 1940 was the first point in the war that Great Britain, and by June 12th the US as well, formed a committee to study the feasibility of a nuclear weapon. By October 1941, the US had begun a nuclear bomb program which would cost them over $2 billion, where it would later be proven on December 2, 1942, that they could create large amounts of energy and plutonium using a nuclear reactor named Chicago Pile 1. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders, but Japan's war cabinet resolves to continue fighting until the bitter end. August 6, 1945, a US B-29 bomber designed by Boeing drops atomic bomb Little Boy on Hiroshima, killing an estimated 140,000 people. On August 9, 1945, the same B-29 drops atomic bomb Fat Man on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 75,000 people. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese surrender to the US, marking the end of World War II.